Hi, I'm Max Keiser.
I'm Stacy Herbert.
Hey, big news. We're in a frickin' war. Stacy Herbert.
That's right. From Vince Cable, we hear that crisis is the economic equivalent of war. And Max, you know, in any good financial war, any war in fact, you need a good general. And I vote for Alexander Lebedev.
Why?
Well, we all know he punched out that guy, right? He clocked a guy. And I think this is probably, had we had somebody like this as Treasury Secretary in the United States at the time, say all these bankers, Lloyd Blankfein goes to Hank Paulson and says, please, I wrote so many bad loans and they've all blown up, help me. If Hank Paulson had just done the same thing, bam!
Well, yeah, we are in a war. That's for sure. That's why I don't understand all this equivocating and quibbling about the pro-Keynesians, the anti-Keynesians, the monetary stimulus crowd, the bailout crowd. If you're in a foxhole and you're getting shot at by financial terrorists, you need to fire back because it's a war. Vince Cable is correct. There are casualties of this war. The impoverishment, the homelessness, the poverty. People don't understand it. They're in a war and they're losing.
Yeah, and instead, you know, in a war, what happened in World War I or World War II, the guy jumped out of the foxhole afraid and ran. The general shot him in the back as the guy was running away. This is the equivalent of what the bankers should be treated like. They're running away from the financial system that they themselves created. Instead, here's an image from William Bonsai 7. Yes, this is Tiny Timmy, and he's in charge of the financial system. The Eurozone shuns Geithner. Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner was in Poland last weekend, and he suggested to the Europeans that it's so easy to solve your problem. You know what you do? You take your 440 billion European Financial Stability Fund and leverage it 10 times and make it worth 4.4 trillion.
Yeah, well, that's the solution in the neoliberal Washington consensus model. It's always to expand the debt. Instead of generals, we've got like General Electric. In there, the White House advising Obama. They, of course, have a vested interest. And Obama's doing whatever General Electric wants them to do. And this is not how you run a country in the interest of the people who you're supposed to serve.
Well, of course, all the Europeans told in-debt Timmy to go take a hike. But there was another friend of Timmy, you know, we all know Fatso, and he's returned. This is Larry Summers and Tim Geithner in this little image, again from William Bonsai 7. You know, we have the financial art for the financial war because no war is whole without the artist.
Yeah, you remember the Troika. America had their own Troika, just like Greece has the Troika that's currently committing financial terrorist acts against that little country. We had the Troika in America. It was Summers, Geithner, and Rubin. Robert Rubin, the three crusaders of unholy financial warfare, totally destabilizing the U.S. economy and raping it for every nickel they could get. And now Summers is coming back? Oh my God.
That's right. With this piece in the FT, the world must insist that Europe act. So Larry Summers is saying an increase in the central financial commitment to the financial stability of member states and a reduction in their financial autonomy is needed if the currency, the euro, is to survive.
Right. Also, Christine Lagarde got her wings clipped. I don't know if you saw that last week, but she came out in the press and suggested that banks needed to improve their capital ratios. She got read the Riot Act by Tim Geithner, who took her in the back room and said, look, no talk about increased cap rates for banks, okay? And he used an epithet at that point. And then she came out the next day singing a completely different song. So forget it, Christine Lagarde, as being some kind of voice of legitimacy. She's in with the Troika.
Well, Timmy Geithner also was in Europe rejecting the common European opinion that there should be a financial transaction tax. And you know, they argue that this is capitalism. You can't have a financial transaction tax. But as we know, with high-frequency trading, the average holding of any share is what, a few microseconds?
600 kiloseconds. So, yeah, I mean, high-frequency trading is high-frequency looting. And those looters in London, I guess the lesson we know about this, we can learn, is that if the looters in London who are looting the shops, if they looted in fractions of a second, they'd be called market makers, and they were therefore adding value to the system. But because they looted and it only took 5 or 10 seconds, then they're now in jail.
Well, so wherever these unelected officials, the Timmy Geithners, the Larry Summers and Christine Lagardes of the world, walk or stalk. Of course, riots soon follow. Greece, new austerity, new riots. The more the Greek government does to get bailout money, the more likely its citizens are to riot. The more they riot, the more its GDP suffers. Apparently, the Troika is insisting on 100,000 more people be fired in Greece, and they're also demanding deeper pension cuts. So we know how the Greeks respond to this, Max.
Well, the goal is loss of sovereignty. The goal of the Troika is to strip Greece of its sovereignty, because they want to extract rent from that economy by seizing the income-producing assets, and they want the Greeks to be slaves in their own country. That's the goal. And this is the Troika, which is just a rebranded junta. If you remember, the junta was in Greece not too long ago. Greek people rose up, got rid of the junta, now they got the Troika. Well, how come they're not doing anything about the Troika? They must have run out of energy to deal with it.
Well, Max, who are the Troika? The ECB, the IMF, the EU. Just groups of engineered institutions of unelected people that are only a few decades old. We created them, and what they want to just take the sovereignty of a 5,000-year-old nation and their culture and their artifacts and their history.
They want to strip it. They want to bleed it. They want to just take it, all the guts and the soul from the country, and sell it on the open market for pennies on the dollar because they're scum.
They're figments of our imagination. They should snap and wake up and let those people go away. Greece should not be Eurozone debt crisis scapegoat. This is Evangelos Venizelos, the finance minister of Greece. And he says, if we want to stabilize the situation, if we want to avert default, if we want to remain in the core of the Eurozone, if we want the country to stop being blackmailed and humiliated, because no citizen should have to put up with humiliation of their country, we have to make three large strategic decisions. And that is, what? More austerity, essentially, he's saying.
He is in bed with the Troika. They need to default. These debts were fraudulently induced to begin with. They have no legal, under the Constitution, before the memorandum rewrote the Constitution, it clearly states that they have no legal obligation to make good on these debts.
Well, exactly, but his very statement, Max, listen to his statement again. If we want to stabilize the situation, if we want to avert default, you don't want to avert default. The bankers want you to avert default.
The words are precise in their meaning and their intent to bamboozle the population into accepting a poisoned chalice, Stacy Herbert.
That's what, exactly. He's using the word we to the people of Greece.
Who's we?
Acting as if their desire should be the same as what the bankers and bondholders want.
He's not a we. He's not Greek. He's a putz. He's not Greek.
And in fact, again, he says if we want to stabilize the situation, then we have to do this thing that is going to destabilize the situation. He's insane.
Well, he speaks in a bamboozling way to try to divert attention from the fact that he's obviously in the employ of the Troika and the bad guys.
He needs to get on a TV show with Alexander Lebedev.
And get his lights punched out on live television. I'll be happy to do it. I'll punch the guy's lights out on this show.
So let's look at the finance minister for Greece and how he has common cause with this right-wing nutcase in Finland. Finnish MP Halla-aho calls for tanks in Greece. He was quoted on Facebook as saying, what Greece needs at this particular point in time is a military junta that would not have to worry about its popularity and could use tanks to enforce some order among strikers and rioters.
They have a military junta. It's called the Troika, and they use weapons of mass financial destruction to disenfranchise and to strip the country of its sovereignty already.
As Vince Cable, who is in the British cabinet, says, it is an economic war. And there is a junta. The three guys of the junta are EU, ECB, and IMF. These guys out of nowhere that were fabricated and engineered and created out of some black cauldron in a witch's den.
Yeah, and Christine Lagarde is a junta-bot. She's a junta-bot. She's not even human. She's less human than Dick Cheney. She doesn't even have a heart. It's just a valve. It's just like a lame valve made out of foie gras.
So this MP who's had one too many saunas, obviously, his brain has shrunk a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, he's been suspended for 2 weeks, but he'll be back in 2 weeks.
Great. Well, his ideas are junk And what's wrong with Finland anyway? They are blocking the whole passage of the collateral that needed to get this loan, but
but that's good. They should default. The Greeks should default. So let them block it, but they don't need a military junta. This guy has taken too many saunas.
Right, but he's saying that they're trying to block it by not accepting the collateral while at the same time saying they need to do a military intervention. They're totally conflicted. That proves the fact that they're drunk and their sauna did the wazoo, and they make no sense in Finland.
It's sauna. Sauna.
I stand corrected.
But tanks are always part of the equation. Wherever bankers go, the tanks follow. And here's the next headline, Max. Tony Blair visited Libya to lobby for J.P. Morgan. Okay, here's the Telegraph, and they think they have breaking news, but Max and I, did we not break this to the world a few months ago?
We've been talking about this on the show for weeks.
Months, I think it is.
Yeah, months. Tony Blair's been in Libya lobbying for J.P. Morgan. Because we know Tony Blair's soul is that of a corrupt Wall Street terrorist.
We knew what he was doing there, but now the Telegraph has found the documentation, and they're also speaking to a senior executive from the Libyan Investment Authority, who said that the $70 billion fund used to invest the country's oil money abroad, that Mr. Blair was one of the 3 prominent Western businessmen who regularly dealt with Saif al-Islam Gaddafi. So he says Tony Blair's visits were purely lobby visits for banking deals with J.P. Morgan. Unlike some other deals, notably some investments run by the U.S. bank Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan's had never turned bad. Max, this is a classic dead book swap. This is how bankers operate their scams. So half the money goes to Goldman Sachs. Whoops, they lost 99% of it. JP Morgan apparently didn't lose money for them.
Right, this is a classic example of cartel thinking or mafia thinking or racketeering. JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs worked together on this. And I can break that story here, just like we broke this Tony Blair story months ago. I'll tell you right now, this will come out in 3 or 4 months, that JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs tag-teamed Libya with Tony Blair, and that Goldman Sachs is positioned as the loser fund, but they got a huge cut of the money that JP Morgan made on this deal. They work together. It's a troika on Wall Street, those 2 guys and Geithner. It's racketeering. In Libya, if they thought they were bad with their weapons and their hijackings and whatnot, they didn't know what bad was until Tony Blair showed up with JP Morgan. Now Gaddafi knows what a terrorist really looks like. Well, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away, much more coming your way, so stay right there. Hi, welcome back to the Keiser Report. Let's time to go to New York and speak with Reggie Middleton of BoomBustBlog.com. Reggie, on the way to the studio, you wrote this on your blog, quote, "I will fly in the face of common wisdom and walk through a run on BNP on international television." Of course, you're referring to this show, Keiser Report. Walk us through your model for a run on BNP Paribas, the biggest bank in France. What are the scenarios for a run on BNP?
There are 3 facets to the scenario. There's the impetus for the problem, which is the fact that BNP is carrying a plethora of assets on its balance sheet at par, basically as a risk-free asset. And as many practical people know, very few assets are actually risk-free. One of their biggest holdings in the sovereign debt arena is the bonds of Greece. Greece is currently trading the 2 and 3 years, so it's currently trading at about 52% of par. And then they're actually trading at it. They're being quoted at 52% of par. From what I understand from the traders I speak to, there are no trades because nobody wants to buy it. So those are synthetic quotes. If they were actually trade, obviously, they'd have to be lower in order to get a bid. So if you were to mark that down, let's say 35, 40, 45 cents on the dollar, and then the fact that BNP leverages their capital roughly 30 to 40 times, you're talking significant losses, and that's just in Greece. If Greece were to default, and the market is pricing in roughly 115% chance of Greece defaulting, think about that math, 115%, but let's say a nearly guaranteed chance of Greece defaulting, it's going to put pressure on other peripheral states as well, and their bonds will trade down, and it's a good chance that they may default, particularly if it's perceived that Greece defaults and achieves some type of benefit from it, such as Iceland, which is one of the fastest growing states in all the EU, or the EU area. Then why wouldn't the taxpayers of Portugal or Ireland default? Instead of going through extreme austerity measures, attempting to pay back massive amounts of debts that they probably wouldn't be able to pay back anyway. So long story short, you have a significant debt problem there. If depositors realize that there's a significant debt issue, they would probably want to move their savings and their checkings accounts out of BNP. This is liquid funding that BNP relies upon. Roughly 72% of short-term funding can disappear overnight, literally overnight. You've seen this happen in the United States. Look at Bear Stearns, which had to be rescued over the weekend, and Lehman Brothers as well, which went bankrupt overnight. So it's a problem that was probably known from the beginning of investment banking, but definitely came to light in 2008 with Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers. Here we are at the end of 2011, and the European banks are sitting on the same precipice. Have we learned our lesson? Obvious answer. Now, on top of the running the bank from the depositors, you also have funding from counterparties, other banks who basically do business with BNP, give them credit lines, loans, swap agreements, etc. If they feel that BNP may not be able to honor up to the contractual agreements, they basically want to leave the door. And the first one out the door is the one with most of the money. The last one out usually gets trampled. So you have a run on the bank from an institutional side with counterparties. Even if they don't run, they can increase their collateral requirements, increase margin requirements, etc. This all pressures BNP from several different sides. Now, to be fair to BNP, they're not the only bank in this situation, but they definitely are in a bank, or is a bank that is in a situation, and it's a precarious situation.
Now, Tim Geithner, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, made a trip to Europe, and he proposed kind of a Euro TARP to try to solve these bank problems. The idea, I guess, being that you would take the balance sheet of BNP, which is completely unsustainable by their ongoing operations. In other words, the bank is technically insolvent. They don't have the ability to roll over their debt. The rumor was that they were begging for dollar funding just a few days ago. They're on the precipice. They are the Lehman of Europe, potentially. And now Timothy Geithner was in Europe saying, well, the solution is to create a Euro TARP, but then he was rebuffed. They said, no, we can work it out ourselves. The theory, I think, is that Germany somehow is going to create a blanket European-wide funding facility where the banks like BNP can roll up all this trash debt on their balance sheets. Is that possible? Is that workable? Or doesn't that give Germany an awful lot of control over the entire Eurozone?
To begin with, here's my thoughts on Germany. Strong economy, very productive. They produce real things, tangible aspects, tangible products and services. But Germany is still a strong export nation. They export primarily to the EU, to the US, and to a much lesser extent to Asia. If the EU is broke, which much of it is, then it's going to affect Germany. You know, Germany can sell things to people who can't afford it. And the second point is, assume Germany can pull all this off. Would it be in their best interest to do it? Would the euro be as advantageous to Germany if they attempt to pull everybody through massive austerity and possibly get defaults anyway? Or should Germany simply pull back and attempt to go it on its own, let the EU fall where it may, and then possibly go back in? I don't have the answers to this, but these are definitely things that need to be tossed up. What Geithner is suggesting is basically create a massive derivative to aggregate the other massive derivatives that are not worth anything, and then what? What's next? You know, you haven't solved the capital problem, you haven't filled the hole, you haven't provided any solution. You simply took a bunch of nonsense from one side of the table, moved it to the other side of the table.
Right, it's extend and pretend, it's a roll up, it's kicking the can down the road. Now, we went to the Twitterosphere. I went to Max Keiser account on Twitter for questions for Reggie Middleton, and we got a couple of questions here. One from Blah Blah. If BNP Paribas does not see a bank run, or they do see a bank run, what impact will this have on the European and global banking markets? Will it spark a contagion? Which entities are most at risk? Now, I think you've already covered the contagious aspect of this, but how do the dominoes fall? In what order would the dominoes fall in France, in Europe, and globally?
If you see a bank run, especially a depositor bank run, you see the ECP provide liquidity. They should, I don't know if they can or cannot, but my presumption would be they should be able to support BNP in and of itself. But BNP has counterparties, so the ECB will have to support BNP, SocGen, the major French banks, and potentially their major counterparties who will probably pull liquidity as quickly as possible. That includes American banks and it includes German banks. It will spread quickly. It's very difficult to map the exact route, but you can see who has exposure, and BNP is too large a bank to have any type of incident such as that exist in a vacuum. So if BNP were to have a run and the run were to get out of control, it would reverberate very quickly throughout Europe.
Here we have a next question from Max De Niro from Twitter. He says, Reggie talks a lot about the system crashing, yet advocates taking profits from trades in the very paper that will die with the system. How does Reggie see the end game? What does he use as a store of value? Okay, so this is a question about you have to be very tricky in trading these markets because at any moment they could collapse. So how do you trade around them, and what do you see ultimately as a store of value?
I have been very bearish on the U.S., especially the U.S. banking system, the real estate, the pricing of treasuries, etc. That being said, I think the U.S. is on an unsustainable path. Its path is not as unsustainable as that of Europe, at least for the short to medium term, because of the sovereign bonds situation and the banks. Europe has its back against the wall, and it's about to fall through the wall momentarily. The last time I was on your show, I was asked this very similar question about if the U.S. dollar would be sustainable in its current path, and I said, nominally, on the face of it, no, but it appears that we're in a triumvirate of economic powers with the U.S., the EU, and China basically kicking the can down the road to see who falls first. Whoever falls first creates capital flight into the other two, which allows those two to kick the can down the road even further. So we have the U.S., which I've discussed in detail. We have the EU, which has its back against the wall and I think is going to blow up momentarily. And then we have China. China is an inflationary bubble sitting on a deflationary precipice. China was able to avoid a lot of the deflationary aspects of the bust by doing what the U.S. did that caused the bubble in the first place, basically allowing the banks to go full force with all the faucets wide open to lend to anything with a heartbeat, or didn't have a heartbeat but looked like it could have a heartbeat if it signed on the app. When you do that, you amass massive NPAs, which are non-performing assets in the banking system. As the assets start to devalue, you have holes, significant losses and gaps on capital. And that's going to happen in China. It's guaranteed. You cannot get 15 years of growth in 3 years and not pay the piper for it. So it's just a matter of who falls first. Right now, it looks like the EU is going to fall first, and it looks like they're going to beat China to it. If the EU and China can last, then they'll outlast the U.S., and the U.S. will fall. It's a matter of not who's in the best condition, but basically who is the least worst of the bad conditions in the triumvirate.
Now, last year, Reggie, Eric Cantona called for French citizens to withdraw their cash from the banks as an act of resistance in this ongoing financial war. Now, the population itself never did withdraw their deposits. Can you see a point, and there's, of course, this protest on Wall Street going on, Occupy Wall Street. Is this an effective way for citizens to engage in what is obviously a predatory aspect to the way the banks are doing business versus how people around the world are getting screwed by the banks? Is forcing a bank closure by withdrawing deposits and possibly going into another currency or precious metals, would this be an effective way to fight this financial war?
It would be synonymous to the large institutional investors who are basically shareholder activists. Normally, the mom and pop household, buys a stock through the retirement plan or through a retail broker. They have very little say-so in how the company is ran. Basically, the company could care less. You have large shareholders who are able to direct larger flows of capital flows of stock purchases and sales, and they definitely have the ear of the company, and the company basically does what these shareholders feel are in the best interest, whether they're right or wrong. If you can get the populace to control their deposit money the same way, which is actually not difficult, but it's maybe difficult to get them to move in unison, then you'd have activist bank depositors, and they can get the banks to act in the best interest of the depositors, or at least what those depositors feel are their best interest. And that's a very interesting concept, to have activist bank depositors. And basically, if you feel that banks are being predatory or taking too much leverage or too much risk, you simply move your money somewhere else. In doing that, you will have banks who will comply, and they have to comply because they use deposits of very inexpensive, very short-term funding. They do it unwisely because this short-term funding can disappear in a heartbeat, literally overnight. So I think it would be a very interesting social economic experiment to have a large group of depositors basically say, we will move our deposits elsewhere if you don't do X, Y, Z. Or basically move the deposits, accelerate the collapse, which is bound to happen in one form or the other, and then build from scratch.
All right, Reggie Middleton, we have to cut it off there. Thanks so much for once again being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you. I look forward to coming back.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Reggie Middleton of boombustblog.com. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, Max Keiser saying, bye, y'all.